Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Dune Imperium Immortality. This is going to be a how to play video and also a strategy guide. If you want the strategies, please feel free to skip to 28:15 in the video. When you're setting up the game, there's going to be a new copy of the research station. Go ahead and take that tile and just drop it onto the board. Next up, we're going to set up this board, but one thing I wanted to show you immediately is that there are icons embedded in this board that actually help you play the game, because whenever you're learning a new mechanic, it's nice to kind of have a visual representation. So I was kind of showing the new players that you can key off of this. So the first one, and it's going to be this scarab looking icon that you can kind of see at the top of this area. I'll try to zoom in a little bit better. So as you can see, there's a scarab icon located right here. That's the Tleilaxu icon and symbol. So at the top of the board, there's a Tleilaxu track. And so a lot of the cards will have a symbol, and I'll go ahead and just zoom in. So here's a case in point. If you see this symbol, it's going to trigger movement on the Tleilaxu track on the top of the screen. Next up, we have a microscope, which is located on this portion right here. And this is going to be the research track. So anytime you pull an icon, it's going to allow your marker to move down this research track. And then finally, at the very bottom, we have specimens. So specimens are going to be a new mechanic in which you're going to be placing some of your troops into this. And this is going to represent sort of the raw genetic material that your house is allocating for these genetic experiments. All right, so a couple other things to note when you're setting up this board, and this is easy to forget because I keep forgetting to do it. Right here, there's a location for you to put 2 spice down. So go ahead and just take 2 spice and stack it here on this track. So the first player that reaches this point will actually pull these spice off. It's a reward. Next up, we have the circular player tokens that we're going to just simply be putting out onto the board. So in this case, I've got green and red. And this is going to represent the beginning of the Tleilaxu track up at this point on the board. Next up, we have the research track, and you're just going to place these icons. So kind of why I wanted to show you these icons like the scarab and the microscope. When you're playing a 4-player game, these get covered up, or at least part of it, when you start the game. And they're kind of hard to see. So if you ever forget like which track is which, feel free to just move these over to the side, and you can see that the microscope is hiding underneath. So for the most part, that's how you set up the board. And then you will have a different sort of card row, which I'm going to go ahead and flash over to on this part. So I'm going to drop this down. And you're going to have like another row. So instead of having the Imperium row, you're going to have a Tleilaxu row. And this is going to comprise all of the genetic experiments. So there's a new draw deck for this. And then you're going to have a couple things out on the table. So you're going to have a location for 2 of these cards to be face up. And what I'm going to do is zoom in. And what we're going to notice at the top of this card is that there is a specimen icon located here. And on the next card, it also has a specimen icon. And then finally, Reclaim Forces also has a specimen icon. That is going to be the cost in specimens that you actually have to pay to get these cards. So when you buy cards in the normal part of your phase, at the sort of the end of your turn, your player turn, when you do your reveal action, what you can do, and I'll go ahead and just flash back over to the Tleilaxu board. So we're going to drop down over to here. So as an example, we've got 3 troops in the specimen location for green. So during your reveal phase, you can spend these like you would resources, and you could buy these cards. So as an example, if you wanted to buy the Guild Impersonator, and it has 2 specimen icons on it, you would just flash over to your board over here. You would remove these 2 troops from the board, then you flash over to here, and then this card would be purchased, and then you could start using that in your deck. Now next to that is going to be a card, and it has kind of a pink top to it, and what this means is that it stays out on the table the entire game. It's a special action that you can perform anytime you're doing a reveal. So what this one does is it allows you to cash in your specimens. So over here it says 3 specimens can be translated into 2 troops. So you can take 3 specimens off the board and then put 2 troops in your garrison. Or additionally, you can get the scarab icon. So the scarab icon then will move you down this Tylaxu track. So let's say that we spend that and we spend our 3. We could then move our green icon marker down this track 1 location. So that's kind of the new setup that you're going to be playing with. And every time you empty one of these cards that goes into a deck, it's the same thing as the other part of the game. You put it face up. Just be sure not to get these cards mixed into your normal draw deck when you're done playing the game. So when you're deconstructing the game, look at the top right corner and make sure all of your cards get back into the right deck. Otherwise, it's going to be messed up for the next time you play the game. So next, we're going to have a quick conversation about a new mechanic called grafting. As an example, I'm pointing to a green sort of border that says graft on that card. I want you to think of grafting as something that you have to always play with another card. So a grafting card itself can never be simply played out onto the board with an agent. It always has to be combined with another card. So as an example, I'm going to use the Sardaukar Legion on the right-hand side of the screen to kind of simulate this. So when I'm playing an agent onto the board and I have a card with graft, this graft card has to be placed with another card, and it could be any card. It could be another grafting card, or it could be a card that does not have graft listed on it. But whenever you play a graft card, it has to go together as a team, so always think of it as, hey, I'm playing these 2 together. Now, what does that mean for the agent? That actually gives you a greater opportunity to take your agent to different locations. So as an example, I have the Spacing Guild icon, and then I also have the Imperial faction icon on this card. Plus I also have the green icon as well. So your agent can go to any of those 3 different spaces on the board, and then when your agent does get there, you get to trigger all of the effects in this gray row. So this one says if you gain spice during this turn, you can add a Spacing Guild faction. In addition to that, you would also get 2 troops from this Sardaukar Legion card as well. So when you're grafting, this seems a little bit counterintuitive. So when you first start playing with this mechanic, it feels somewhat restrictive. Because basically what I'm doing is that now I'm taking 2 cards to place an agent, which means that I'll have 1 less card during my reveal step. So it kind of almost feels like I'm getting less out of my cards. Now, where this thing starts to shine is that a lot of these grafting cards have special abilities that trigger, and they give you something extra and in addition to kind of what you're playing. So what I'm going to recommend that you do is that when you're purchasing these cards, and a lot of these are going to be the Benetilax cards that you have to spend specimens on, be really careful the order in which you play them. So you don't have to use a graft card necessarily unless it's optimal for you. So where I saw players struggling is that they had graft cards and they felt that they had to spend them on the agent, even though they weren't necessarily getting the benefit from the graft. So in that case, you're actually kind of losing out on the exchange. And so what I'd recommend is keep a graft card in your hand, unless you can trigger the special ability, and then use it during your reveal phase, because that's going to kind of give you a little bit more resources. Now, on the flip side of that, if you're meeting the condition, like in this case, getting a faction bump is a pretty good way to gain victory points in this game. So think of it that way, that grafting is cool, but you have to understand the mechanic and don't just spend it haphazardly. Make sure that you're getting the most out of it over the course of the game. Otherwise, you're actually gonna fall behind when it comes to your reveal phase in the game. So in this example, I've replaced the Sardaukar Legion with this experimentation card. And to kind of show you that there's a way that you can optimize sort of what you're producing and making in the game using graft. So in this case, we're going to graft, and we're going to use the yellow triangle icon. So notice this says if you gain spice this turn, you can increase your Spacing Guild faction. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we also have a research icon. So since we're grafting, these are going to come out into play together. And I'm going to use the yellow triangle icon for a very specific reason. So I'm going to flash over to the board, and I'm going to go to the Imperial Basin. And notice that we have the yellow triangle icon right here. And this is actually a space that produces spice. So in this case, I would want to send my agent up here to the Imperial Basin, as opposed to just simply going over to one of the Spacing Guild locations. And the reasoning behind that is that now that I'm getting spice, it triggers the special ability on the graph card. So if you gain spice this turn, you can increase your faction standing with a Spacing Guild. So that would be fantastic. In addition to that, it also triggers movement on the research track itself. So then I could simply pop over to the research track itself. And in this case, I'm going to move, we're just going to say we're the green player still. I'm going to move my research track one position. And now I get a benefit, which is adding a specimen into my specimen location down below. So by using the grafting mechanic, you can really maximize your turns. And in this case, we gained a faction, in addition, a research icon, and we gained some spice all in one turn, which is absolutely fantastic. So when using grafting, make sure you're using it effectively. I'm going to make a quick comment about sort of the basic core setup of this game. So if you're new to the Immortality expansion, you're going to notice that your opening starting cards are going to be a little bit different. So in your normal deck, if you've played the first two expansions, you're going to have this card called Dune, the Desert Planet. And depending on whether or not you like playing Control the Spice, this is going to change fundamentally how your original deck is going to be. So when you're playing Immortality, these two cards are going to be removed from the deck, and instead they're going to be replaced with two experimentation cards. And please note that these are both going to be the yellow triangle cards. And then at the bottom of the card is the reveal step. So notice that the ones on the right, the experimentation cards, are going to be slightly better. You're actually going to get something additionally out of it. So you're going to get one resource when you reveal, and then you're also going to get a specimen. In conjunction, this card is a lot better anyway than Dune the Desert Planet, because when you're placing an agent, you can also go down the research track, which is going to give you additional benefits when you play the game. So something else that you're going to see, and this is an option and a variant, so I'm going to go ahead and just pull these off the table. And in this case, if we've replaced them with the experimentation, your draw deck is going to be 10 cards, which it would be in a normal game. And now there's a variant if you own the Rise of Ix expansion. This is something that I enjoy and our play group has enjoyed. But what you're going to do is add one copy of Control the Spice to each player's sort of like starting deck. Now, where this gets a little bit complicated is that Control the Spice isn't going to go into the original draw deck. It's going to go into the discard pile. So I'll kind of walk you through what that looks like. So in this case, I've got 10 cards. I have all of my normal cards. These are going to form my initial draw deck. So if I'm using Control the Spice as a variant, and I have the Rise of Ix expansion, this is going to go in the top of my discard pile. So this is going to be where my discard pile starts, and then I've got 10 cards in my draw deck. So Control the Spice won't be in my initial opening draws, and it'll be impossible for me to get it until I run out of cards, and then I cycle Control the Spice into the game. Now, I do like using Control the Spice. I think it's a fun card, and it's a nice way to add something into the game, especially if you have the Rise of Ix expansion. So I'm going to recommend playing that if you have both of the expansions. Something I'm going to make a comment on really quickly is that the game designers for Dune Imperium have done an excellent job at balancing the game as new expansions come out. And I'm really impressed with how this version of the game really comes together, and it's super balanced as opposed to the original version of the game, which I still love. But what's interesting is that after playing Dune Imperium, a gazillion times, you start noticing certain things that can happen over the course of the game. And one of them is where like the Imperium row, where you purchase cards during your reveal phase, can get bogged down. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you a quick example. So this has happened, I can't tell you how many times in the game when we've played it, where like the opening draw can be kind of messed up and crazy. So if you look at the top of these, everything is anywhere from 5 to 8 resources when you do your reveal step. And when you first start playing the game, you're only going to have just a couple of points during your reveal phase. And what happens to the game is that it gets bogged down, and you can't really buy anything from the Imperium row until this gets resolved. So what the game designers did is they added a new sort of mechanic in, and they call it the family atomics. So they give each of the players one of these markers. And what you can do, and you can only do this during your turn itself, but you can actually discard this token. And what that allows you to do is wipe everything in this row. All of these things will go into the discard pile, and then you get to draw a new Imperium row. In this case, I'm just doing this randomly, so we're going to see what happens. And as you can see, the mix is a lot better, and it's a lot easier for you to start buying cards actually down here. So that's kind of one of the nice additions to the game, is that it prevents that bog down. But please note that this token can only be used once per game. Something else that I've noticed when I've been teaching the newer players to play this, most people do not use their family atomics symbol at all. And I kind of want to state that that's probably a mistake, so at least try to use it once per game. There's something else that is kind of an unwritten rule that I noticed some of the better players that they started to do. So as an example, maybe I've got this occupation card, which is a heavy hitting card. Now, you might not want your opponent to have that. So if your opponent is basically having really huge reveal steps and they're able to purchase these really big cards sort of mid-game, you note that you're going to fall behind pretty rapidly. So if you see that a card comes out onto the table, and watch kind of the expressions on the other players' faces when something comes out, you can tell sometimes that they want to purchase a card. And it's kind of a nasty tactic, but if you think that they're going to get something that's really going to make their deck take off, you can use this family atomic symbol to wipe the row so that they don't have the opportunity to purchase whatever card that you think that they're going to get and gain massive advantage out of. So that's kind of like a counter tactic that you can use. You're not using it necessarily for yourself, but you're using it to hinder your opponent during the course of the game. Another comment that I want to make, and this is another optional rule, which I think really is impactful for the game. So our game group, we typically play Dune Imperium literally like 95% of the time with 4 players. I think it's the best version of the game. I think it's really exciting. But when you do that, the traditional game had you start right here for a 4-player game where you basically have 1 victory point. So one of the variants that they added into the game is that they recommend that you start at 0 victory points when you start the game off. And I actually agree with this quite a bit. And the reasoning behind it is that when you're playing Dune Imperium, I really love this game. And when you start purchasing cards from the card row and you're mixing it through your deck, you want to be able to utilize that engine that you've built. So it's just a little bit more satisfying to kind of have an extra point that you need to win the game. So as you zoom out, you can terminate the game at 10 points. Then also too, they recommend in the game that you can also go to 11 points as well. So you can kind of choose what you want to do. Now the sweet spot for our game group was really starting at 0 and then going to 10. And I think that just gives you basically an extra turn or maybe 2 total to kind of play the game and enjoy the engine that you've built, especially late game. As like part of this game, once I have a strategy built, I want to like utilize it over and over again, and that's really exciting. And the traditional game, it felt like it was just a little bit too short, so I do recommend adding an additional victory point on so you can experience your engine just a little bit longer. We're going to take a brief moment to talk about the research track. I want you to notice that there's 2 locations on here in which you can get intrigue cards, and in addition to that, there are 2 locations where you can score victory points. This is a huge change to the game. These two locations on this track are accessible to any player. So any player can advance their marker to these two different locations and gain those victory points. That's extremely important. That allows you to diversify your strategy. Oftentimes you have to really focus on combat to get a lot of those victory point wins toward the end of the game because you've done a lot of your faction point stuff as you kind of creep up toward endgame. This is a great way to throw in 2 extra locations to score without doing combat. So keep in mind that that scarab icon is going to trigger this research track, so be extremely mindful of that. I found that pretty much most players that we're playing with now will get to this point at a bare minimum. So every single player, now that this expansion is coming out, they seem to try to get at least this victory point, I've noticed. And a lot of the players will end up literally right here, and then maybe 1 out of 4 of the players, if you're playing a 4-player game, will go for the endpoint objective. So keep that in mind. This is a great way you can score 2 additional points. I'm going to teach you now how to use the research track itself. If you can remember, we have the microscope icon, which is located here. So as an example, if you were to play an experimentation card and send your agent to a location, you would get this microscope icon, which allows you to progress your marker down this track. So here's how it kind of works. The first time you move, you can only go to the initial location on this board. In this case, it triggers the addition of a specimen. That's what this green cube icon means. Now from this point onward, you kind of have a choice on how you move down this track. As an example, if you were to play yet another experimentation card, you could then move your marker either to this location up here on top or this location here on the bottom. So you kind of have the opportunity to customize how you're using this track and how it plays into your overall strategy. So as an example, if you're somebody that is kind of favoring specimens, you can see that you can kind of snake through the board and acquire a fair number of specimens along the way. In addition to that, you might actually favor the Benetilax track up here on top, which is a kind of a faction track. So once you get to here, you might say, you know what, I'm going to move to the Scarab location, and then I get 1 point up here on the track. And then the next turn, maybe you play another experimentation card, and then you can progress down this track. So what makes this kind of fun is that you get to kind of customize how you're researching things. In addition, there are 3 of these on the board, which are the research icon. So when you hit it, it's almost like getting a double move. So as an example, let's say you play an experimentation card. It allows you to trigger this icon. You can then move to this part on the board, and when you do that, it allows you to double move. So you can basically go 1, 2 in the same turn. What this allows you to do is to move down the research track a little bit faster. And as I said before, there are 3 of these icons on this board. Now what's kind of interesting, and I noticed a couple of the players doing this, and once they figure it out, they keep doing it over and over again. On the top part of this track, there's 2 of these research icons, so you can have a player progress pretty quickly along the top end of this track. As an example, they move to here and get a free move, and then move to here. Then, you know, it's not unheard of for the next turn they can play another one and go boom, boom. So in this case, they can move very rapidly down this track. Now, why does that matter? I'll kind of walk you through some of the additional stuff that you find at the bottom of the board and what happens when you reach the end point of this track. Let's talk about the bottom part of the board really quickly. There are a couple of bonuses that you can obtain as you're going down this research track. So kind of what's interesting about this is that these are certain thresholds. So if you think about it this way, you have like a column essentially on this part of the board, and then you have a column at the end of the board as well. So once your marker gets into this location, you've actually unlocked this icon. And similarly, if you hit the end of the board at any of these different parts of this board, you unlock these 2 icons, which are the double helix. So what does this kind of mean? I'll go ahead and zoom in really quickly. And there are some icons associated with it. So let's say your marker hits this spot on the board, it unlocks the first helix. What the first helix means is that any cards with a helix on them, with one single helix. So as an example, we have this Vicious Talents card. It unlocks additional sorts of bonuses for you. So if you're just playing this card normally, this intrigue card in combat, you would get 2 battle markers. But if you have unlocked sort of the first stage of this track, which corresponds to this one DNA helix, you get an additional 2. And then if you go all the way down and you have this marker unlocked with 2, you get all of those bonuses, which is absolutely fantastic. So it can supercharge some of these cards that appear in the new set. In addition to that, there are other aspects that make it beneficial as well. So as we look at this, there's a new icon listed on the board. So I'll kind of go ahead and zoom in on that. So hopefully we can get into focus. I think that's the best we can do. What this corresponds to the new sort of genetic cards that come with the set. Once this is unlocked, if you buy a card from sort of the Tylaxu row over here, so let's say we buy the Twisted Mentat card. Normally when you buy a card, it would go into your discard pile. But if we have this part of the board unlocked at the bottom, what this icon means is that it doesn't go into your discard pile, it goes onto the top of your draw deck. So this is a fantastic advantage for these newer cards. You don't have to wait for them to cycle through your draw deck. They go immediately on top of your draw deck and you can play them right away. So that gives you a little bit of extra play when it comes to some of those newer cards. Now what we're going to do is shift down toward the end sort of column that's located here. And notice that at the bottom there are 2 DNA helixes located on this card. So kind of what we've been looking for is some of the cards trigger based upon if you have those 2 icons unlocked. So in this case, this intrigue card would give you an additional bonus at the end of the game if you have your marker has reached the end point of this column. Now, something else that you're going to notice is there's a research icon located down here. Then there's a colon and then the draw card symbol. So once you hit the end of this research track, you might kind of say to yourself, well, a lot of the cards that I've invested in are now pointless. Well, what's great about this game is that once you hit this end column, if you get the microscope icon, it allows you to just simply do a card draw. So you don't have to think of it as, hey, I've wasted all these resources getting to the end of the track. Card drawing is very impactful in this game, especially late game. So if you reach the end of this track, it's highly possible for you to have a lot of card drawing as a result of how you've built your deck. So what's interesting is that you can have players that really focus on this research track, and then they hit the end of this track and they have a massive amount of card drawing, which comes in handy at the late part of the game, and it can be highly impactful. Now it's time to get into some of the strategies that we saw when we started playing this expansion. The first one, I'm going to call it, is basically specimen supercharging. This is a strategy that I've seen multiple players employ to kind of get their deck going at a pretty rapid pace, and it's pretty shocking on what they can do. So here's what it looks like when the game starts. Obviously, you're going to have your draw deck of 10 cards, and if you're using the Control the Spice card, this is going to end up in your discard pile. So what that means is that in your initial 10 cards that are going to be cycling through your deck, you're going to have 2 experimentation cards that are going to be hidden in there. And that's something that you could potentially draw either 0, 1, or both of these cards on the first turn, and then consequently on the next turn, you're going to have an opportunity to get the other one if you didn't get it in your first opening hand. So think of it this way. In your first 2 turns, you have the ability to get 2 different research icons. So we're not going to focus on where we're actually sending our agent. We're just going to focus on the research track right now. So one thing I've noticed is kind of the concept of specimen charging. And what does that mean? Is that anytime you draw one of those research sort of markers on your card, you want to be adding specimens. So as an example, here's your first move for a specimen. Then your second move would also be a specimen. Now, what's interesting on this track, you can see that there's an option now to move down this track as well again and get another specimen. And then you can actually do it again. So you can have 4 specimens, and then you could even go to a 5th. So kind of where I'm going to stop is right here on the 4 specimens and kind of walk you through what you're doing to kind of get your deck supercharged. So what's interesting about this game is that you have this secondary set of cards in the Tailaxu row, so to speak. Now, they're going to range in cost from anywhere from 1 to 4 specimens. Okay, so when you're employing this specimen strategy, there's 2 different things that you can do. So the first one is that you can really gain control of a super powerful card early on in the game. So like I said, these range anywhere from 1 to 4 specimens, but if you can get a pretty decent specimen in the first like 3 to 4 turns of the game, then this card is going to be cycling through your deck, and your deck doesn't have a whole ton of cards in it. So during your reveal stage, you can actually purchase cards from the Imperium row with Persuasion. In addition to that, you can purchase another card during the same reveal phase by just spending your specimens. So one of the tactics and strategies is to immediately supercharge your deck by gaining a pretty powerful and potent one of these cards early on in the game, okay? So secondarily, what you can do, and I'll go ahead and go back to this part of the board, there's a secondary strategy which deals with combat. So I will walk you through what that looks like from the experimentation perspective. It's a little bit more complicated strategy, but I've seen a lot of players really cash in on this strategy as well. The next strategy that we're going to talk about assumes that you, as a player, has both the Rise of Ix expansion and the new Immortality expansion. So there's something that you can do to get your combat engine supercharged at the beginning of the game. I'm going to walk you through kind of what that looks like. So as we talked about before, you're going to have 10 cards basically in your first draw pile, which allows you to have a couple experimentation cards actually in there. Now, something that some of the players miss initially is considering the shipping track in conjunction with this new sort of research track. So you can kind of almost double up this strategy. I'm going to walk you through what that looks like. Here's what we have here. We have a experimentation card with a research icon. Please note too that it also has the yellow triangle icon on this. So if you're lucky enough to go early in the turnaround, here's a strategy that you can employ if you're going to be combat oriented over the course of the game. As an example, we're going to play this experimentation card and we have one of our green agents here. So where can that agent go? So I'm going to flash over to the shipping track on the board, and please notice that you do have this icon, so you have the triangle. In addition to that, it's going to push the research track. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to place our agent here on the board. That's allowing us to go up the shipping track 1 location. Now, what's nice about this is that you can gain 5 Solari very quickly by just simply doing another shipping track action. You can spend it to drop back down. You gain 5 Solari. All of your opponents are going to gain 1. Now, why are you actually doing that? And the answer to that is you're going to be using that Solari to be purchasing a Dreadnought. So something that you could do early on in the game is that once you have the Solari, now what you're going to focus on is purchasing a Dreadnought. So maybe in a subsequent turn, obviously you have to cash this in and drop it back down, but in addition to that, you're going to be looking to purchase this Dreadnought early on in the game. So Dreadnoughts are going to be used for basically repeatable and consistent combat. So here's something else that you can do. So while we're spending this experimentation icon to enhance our shipping track, we're moving down the board and we're amassing specimens. So as we start going through here, we're going to snake down the board and we're going to follow this track. And what this is going to do is it's going to start building up troops in our specimen sort of spot. Now, what can you do with 3 specimens? I'm going to pop over to this side of the board and we're going to look at what's called reclaimed forces. Reclaim Forces allows you during your reveal step to cash in 3 specimens, and you can then do that to place 2 troops into your garrison. Or you can go ahead and get the Scarab icon and move down the Benetilax faction track. But if you're a combat-oriented player, think about what you're doing. You're using the Solari from the shipping track to purchase a Dreadnought early on in the game. In addition to that, you're using your specimens from the research track to cash in for additional troops in your garrison. So think about the overall theme. You can amass troops very, very quickly by using a combination of the shipping track in addition to the research track. Next, I'm going to walk you through yet another strategy that became apparent. As we started playing this game, I noticed that there was one player that was doing something pretty subtle. So after seeing this tactic numerous times, I just kind of quizzed the player at the end of whatever game it was. I said, hey, what exactly are you doing? Because I noticed that they were doing the same thing over and over again, but I really wanted to understand the reasoning behind it. Now, this strategy is basically a Fremen, Bene Gesserit, Benetilax sort of faction-based loop that they were doing. So what does that look like, and how do you actually get it going? So I'm going to go ahead and pop this over to the Fremen part on the board. So one of the things that you can do sort of like right away, and a lot of people find this location pretty good at the very start, is to get the still suits. What this is going to do is it's going to give you 1 water. In addition to that, it's going to raise your faction with the Fremen 1 spot on this tracker. Now, once you have that water, please note that you start the game already with a 2nd water already. So you can then either do one of 2 things. You can pop over to the Bene Gesserit track, and you can get the secrets part where you start getting an intrigue card. But then there's something else kind of up on the board that we should talk about. Now, with the new Immortality expansion, they added and they changed the research station. So what you're going to see now is that there's a research marker on this. And note too that you're going to need 2 water to go to this spot. And then it also allows you to draw 2 cards. So what's really kind of weird is that you can literally, on kind of like your opening turn almost, you can get this to trigger because you've already picked up the water. You start with a water, so you can actually hit this research station fairly early on in the game. It allows you to draw 2 cards, and it allows you to progress down the research track a little bit faster. So kind of what that looks like is simply this. So we've already talked about that you're going to have 2 experimentation cards that are cycling through your first 10 cards in your draw deck. That's going to give you access to 2 of these microscope icons. So by employing the strategy that I just showed you early on in the game, you can actually move your marker a total of 3 spaces down this track. And what this person was doing, and they were able to do this fairly consistently, is that in the first sort of opening round with these 3 different research markers that they're cashing in, they were able to progress down this track pretty quickly. So as you can see, there's 2 scarab icons, and you're going to be putting 2 troops into the tanks over here. So they were able to move to this location here up on the track. So please note that by going down here, you can now end up here, which gives you an intrigue card. So this player loves intrigue cards, and now we're going to kind of scope in the Bene Gesserit side as well. So anybody that's played this game knows that the secret spot is pretty coveted. But if you then start amassing intrigue cards by going down the Benetilax track, and then also getting them with the Bene Gesserit tract as well, this person was able to amass a pretty large amount of both Bene Gesserit faction and Benetilax faction as well. So the player said quite honestly that this is something that should probably just be at the bottom of the board because it is a faction. And I didn't actually think about the game in that manner, but it was really insightful. So what they're trying to do is always hit this marker, and they're actually going to hit it first. It's not like the spice is that impactful, but still it's a free bonus. So once we start looking at that strategy, and if they keep doing it over and over again, Notice that there's this research marker down here. They're able to then jump pretty quickly. In addition to that, there's another scarab icon here, which pushes you to this location right here. Then what they're going to do is they're either going to target right here or right here, depending on if they really want to go far down the track. But essentially what they can do is they can ensure that they're going to hit this before any other player does. So they can actually hit this spot on the board way earlier than any other player can because they're moving so fast down this track. So in addition to that, there's some weird mechanics that start showing up. And this one is you can trash an entry card to do a card draw and then get a different entry card. This stuff is pretty fascinating and it gives you a lot of power. Now, by doing this strategy, they're not just going down this track rapidly, but they're also then able to really kind of cash in on stuff that's happening on the board. So I'm going to zoom back to the research station. And there's something kind of intriguing about this. And note that you're allowing yourself to draw 2 cards. That gives you really powerful reveal actions. And it also helps you nullify something. So if you're using a lot of grafting cards, you're having to take a card from your hand and graft it onto another one, so your reveal steps are naturally going to be a little bit worse. So what I noticed this player, they were basically stabilizing the grafting mechanic by using the research station and then burning down the track at a rapid pace. Now, what else that gave them a huge advantage on is card drawing in middle and end game. So now that they're at the end of this track, they've unlocked this icon, which anytime a research sort of icon comes out into play, they can draw a card. So you know what they kept doing? Well, they kept going back to the research station. Now they're tapped out at the end of the research track, so this is actually a 3rd card draw. So they're actually able to supercharge these turns and have these really crazy reveal turns. And what were they doing with that? It was pretty smart. It was allowing them to buy the Spice Must Flow. This thing is extremely expensive, but it gives you a victory point every time you buy one. Now, by doing this strategy and having all the card drawing, it was significantly easier for this player to buy Spice Must Flow cards, and they were able to do it pretty effectively and pretty consistently. So kind of to sum it up, there's this kind of weird Bene Gesserit, Bene Tilax loop that you can perform to kind of supercharge your deck so you can get Spice Must Flow cards or really, really intense reveal actions. So this is a very subtle strategy, but I've seen this player employ it numerous times, and it is very, very successful. I'm going to now walk you through a different player's strategy and kind of the reasoning behind what they were doing. This one is going to be an Imperial faction, spice harvesting centric strategy that also uses Bene Tilax technology to get this really jump started. So I'm going to go ahead and start by placing the camera really where the Imperial faction is. And we're going to be looking at this Conspire spot on the board. And please note that in order to trigger this, we need to have 4 spice. Now 4 spice is a pretty difficult objective to obtain in this game, especially early on. But what we want to focus on when we're playing the Imperial faction and doing some spice harvesting is that we are going to make sure that we are amassing troops. So this is kind of a similar strategy to what we have seen before, but I'll kind of walk you through kind of what that looks like. So by popping over into the portion of the board where spice harvesting occurs, now what we're going to do is once again take a look at our 2 experimentation cards, and we note that they have the triangle icon and that we also have research icons on them. So if you can see that really what we're going to be doing is looking for spice harvesting. And early on, it just depends on a player's strategy. I think most people gravitate more toward faction build-up at the beginning of the game and less towards spice harvesting. I think a lot of players like to wait until the maker phase and then you actually have a little bit more spice out here to harvest before you get this going. So think of it as use your experimentation cards to get some basic spice sort of building up. Now, kind of what we talked about before is you also have the shipping track up here, and so you can use your agent to go up here as well, and then move up here. Now, please note on this side of the board, though, you do have 2 spice, or you do have 5 Solari. So that can give you an advantage as well. So instead of taking the Solari, this player was focusing on spice and spice harvesting. Now, why that's impactful to them is that they also wanted to amass troops. So when they were playing their experimentation cards, they were actually kind of snaking through the board, favoring, putting subjects into the tanks, right? And filling this up. And what they were doing with this is the same thing that I talked about before with the reclaimed forces cards. They were using that to generate troops and then place into their garrison. So by kind of employing this sort of faction, the other thing that they were doing is, since they were harvesting spice so often, it made it extremely practical for them to play the highlighter space on the board, which is absolutely ridiculous when it comes to combat. It generates a lot of water. It also generates a lot of troops. So by doing this strategy, they were also too gaining enough Solari that they could then easily deal with some of the places on the board that are hard to buy, specifically like the High Council and then the Swordmaster space. So that's 5 Solari, and that one's going to be 8. So by kind of employing this tactic, what they were doing is building up troops and going to spots on the board which really aren't utilized all that much, at least in the beginning of the game. They're heavily more utilized in the mid to late game. But early on, people really don't focus on a lot of these spots, nor can they afford them because they're very difficult to get. So overall, there's other strategies that you can employ. They're almost kind of like a blend of existing strategies. So keep your eyes open and think about some of these core strategies that I've taught you about. What you can do is you can take bits and pieces of them, and you could also be somewhat nimble when you're playing the game, and you can say, hey, you know what? The board's looking kind of awful this turn. I'm going to kind of maybe switch over to another sort of side strategy, but at least you have a second bag of tricks that you can dig into if the board starts getting cluttered with agents. To sum it up, the Immortality expansion is a great addition to the game. I feel that with each expansion that they've added, the Rise of Ix included, it feels like they're kind of like filling in the cracks and really polishing the game. And this is no exception. So with Immortality deployed and implemented, this game feels complete to me. It feels like they really brought everything together nicely and put like a bow on top of it. So if you're looking for this expansion in particular, do I agree with purchasing it? Like, absolutely. I thought it was fantastic. I do feel like, I'm a little bit torn. I kind of feel like since the game feels done to me, I almost think that the game designers should stop because it's a really polished product at this point. Now, obviously, it's totally up to them if they want to continue on. But for me, this feels really balanced. It feels really polished. So I want to thank you all for joining me today for this video on the basic how to play and tips and tricks. So thanks again for your time. And as always, have fun gaming.